Good evening, YouTube. It's been a while, but the life advice stays the same. Let's talk about national intelligence and economic growth. It's about our new paper that's been making the rounds the last 10 days or so. Really, what we're very interested in replicating or having more of is this miracle. There's essentially the Industrial Revolution happened and economic growth started being a real thing. And if you were to look at, say, the time since 1200 whatever until 1800, there's basically barely any growth. There's some slight growth from 1700 and forward. And even I think in the 1600s there were some very bad periods with degrowth. So basically you want more growth because the reason the world now is a lot nicer than back then is because we have economic growth and all the nice things that come with having more money. And here's a different way of looking at the same, where again, I believe it's still England, and you can see it kind of goes back and forth. This is a total GDP, which is also a function of population size. So if we just look at the per capita, you can see that in 1200s they were actually wealthier than in the 1400s. So there was kind of a bad time there, and then in the latter part of the 1600s, there was some bad stuff again. Then since 1700s, it's just been increasing. And so with this in mind, what we really want is more growth, right? We want more growth, we want to sustain it more. So what else to do? I mean, if only we had an academic field that was studying this thing. Oh wait, we do, of course, economics. So let's ask an economist, and you can see what kind of things economists are now experts of. They're interested in crisis, universal basic income, so like communist stuff. A lot of stuff, childcare. Economists are apparently all over the world, or all over the place, but they're not so much interested in the basic things. The other problem with listening to economists is that well, they're full of shit. And so one very nice paper here looked at the distribution of kind of the p hacking. So these are the p values that has been rescaled, and so the set score is the is how far it is as such away from a how close you are to just saying whether it's chance or not. So this roughly the value of 2 here, that's what corresponds to P of 5. And so when you see a massive spike around uh, this 2 sets, that means that there's large p hacking. If you didn't do p hacking, then this distribution would just be kind of looking like this. There wouldn't be any like weird peaks. There would only be one peak to the left part over here, right? So you can see that if you look at the summaries, the reported results in studies, instrumental variables, these are very bad because you can see the peak at 2 is actually stronger than the peak at 0. So there's an extreme amount of p hacking going on. Differences is also extremely p hacked, whereas randomized controlled trials are only somewhat p hacked, and regression discontinuity models are also kind of moderately p hacked. So that's the main problem with like reading economics papers, is that essentially you don't know whether these the paper you're looking at, whether these are honest results or some people who have been engaging in too much of this p hacking stuff. A different way of thinking about the problem is that when you're looking at a given study about something, there's a lot of ways to analyze the same data. And as you can see here, they have 30 teams who were, well, 30 something teams. They were given the same data set and they were told to answer the same question. And so they came up with 30 different models or so. And you can see these are the estimates for this log odds variable they're interested in. And you can see the estimates are all over the place. So some teams estimated the odds ratio to be about 3, and you can see, for instance, let's say you're looking at this Tobit regression paper. This confidence interval basically touches almost 0 here. So the p-value for this paper will be 0.049 or something like that. It's extremely p-hacked. Somehow there's no confidence interval for this one. Basically, a lot of them are positive, but then you have some ones over here that are overlapping 0. So if you didn't know which kind of paper it would be, so suppose you open a paper and you don't know whether you're getting this result or that result, right? It just depends on who was analyzing the data. It's not necessarily a political bias, it's just you can see the different methods you can try: Spearman correlations, multi-level, logistic binomial, blah, blah, blah. Often you have all kinds of data analysis options for a given data set, and then this is you can also do the exclusions and all this sort of thing. A partial solution for this problem is something called the Bayesian Meta-analysis, or BMA. We're going to be going into details of that later. But to return to economic growth, there are some people who have been using that for studying economic growth. This is the latest in this kind of saga, and the first paper is the Salah and Martin from 2000 or so, 2001. I guess I should have included it here, but the problem is that the answer you get is kind of unsatisfactory. Suppose you want to predict economic growth from 1960 to 1990 or something like this. So you read the literature of economics, you find all the studies, and you look for all the things that they've been claiming are important for economic growth, like not being in the tropics or having being in a faraway latitude. These obviously are very similar. You can have like Europeans in your country, or maybe you have a legal system that's based on the kind of the British legal system, or whether you were colonized or something like this. So you can come up with a list of 37 of these kind of predictors, and you can kind of test them out against each other. And so what happens in a typical paper is that people pick not all 37 of these because they couldn't fit their model. They would pick, say, 5 of them based on theory, which just means based on their hunch, and then they're going to include those in the model, and then they're going to report the ones that looks like results that they like, right? So you can be sure the p-values will be below 5 or whatever it is they're claiming. And so your question is, have they reported these models honestly? Did they just try 50 different models and only report the ones that worked, that is, gave a small p-value for the variable they were promoting, whatever that variable may be? Or did they not cheat? You don't really know. But one way of doing that is this BME method. And the problem is that the results is that they can't find anything that's kind of consistent across many papers. Or in this study, they looked at different growth periods. So they looked at, are the predictors that predict economic growth in, say, 1960 to 1980, are these the same predictors as the ones that predict from 1980 to 2000, right? You would expect these to be roughly the same predictors over time, and they show that using this method that this is not the case. So essentially, you kind of have this what they call robust ambiguity, that we can't know nothing. We can't know nothing. And so, of course, that doesn't really give us the policy advisor people much interested. They're saying we don't know. It's not very interesting. The problem with this kind of study is that, well, they didn't include intelligence as a predictor. And here I've pasted in all the predictors in their study, so you can see they have all kinds of stuff like shared Christianity, Jews, Islam, Buddhists, demography, fertility rates, population sizes, life expectancies, colonial history, and so on, right? They tried all these things, and they basically say we can't find anything consistent. But there are some studies that have included intelligence, and the first study, well, that included intelligence as such, is this paper from 1995, or it was published in 2000, that is to say, it made it past peer review. And they used this was before PISA was a thing, so they used the other kind of PISA-like datasets like TIMSS, and I think before TIMSS you had the previous version of TIMSS, and there are some older ones too. And based on these actual test scores, you could estimate actual human capital. And the lesson here is that before, economists were always very interested in human capital since 60s or something, and but they were not really measuring human capital as such. They were just kind of assuming human capital is the result of education. So they were using educational attainment rates as their predictors and their kind of measure of human capital. And what Hanushek and Kimco here they did is that they said, wait a minute, we already have like test scores. Why don't we just like look at the actual test scores from these international tests and then check if these can predict growth? And indeed, they find that even back then with this tiny sample size that they predict growth pretty well. And there's I have a long page here for these those of the readers who are interested in reading more of this stuff. I basically looked over the literature and I found every single paper that used test scores and some approach to predict growth, and I believe you can read over these if you're interested in the history. There is one recent paper, very good, that also used intelligence and this kind of libertarian approach with the economic growth is kind of a function of intelligence and of economic freedom. Because everybody knows that communists are poor, and this has something to do with their communism. And so he finds that that these work well together. It's a really long paper. I highly recommend reading this Christiansen paper. I'll link it in the descriptions and probably in the comments, so you don't miss it. There is only one paper previously that have used this good methods, the Bayesian Meta-analysis and intelligence. This is the only paper of this kind. It's by Garrett Jones and Joel Snyder. 2006 is when it's from. It basically finds that if you try out all these kind of predictors, very similar to this study with the 37 ones, but if you just add intelligence to this kind of data set, they find that this works very well, and IQ is like the best one, basically. The problem with this paper is that first, it's kind of old. Well, actually, the problems are listed here. Yeah, so the problem is that it's outdated because first it used the Richard Lynn 2002. So this is the first book-length compilation of these national intelligence data. So it didn't use the newer data sets. Now we have the Lynn data, the 2012 Lynn data set. We have the Rinderman data set, and we got the Becker data set, and the World Bank data set, and there's even those copycat people who published in the Lancet, believe it or not, I think it's Koreans, who basically plagiarized Richard Lynn and then republished his national IQs called Learning Outcomes or something in the Lancet, kind of very PC, very PC journal. So if someone attacks you for saying, it's just pseudoscience published in Mankind Quarterly, you should just cite these like very nice natured copycat Asians publishing in the Lancet, and then you say, we use their data. That aside, the other problems is it's lacking in details. This paper is kind of brief. It's like 20 pages, but they don't actually include the proper tables, so you cannot really compare the outcomes from intelligence to the other variables because they didn't give the complete output and they didn't give the code, and so it's really not possible to say what the complete outcomes would do or even replicate it. So that's disappointing. It's lacking in robustness tests. There's a lot of newer criticism of BMA, and these consist of like different priors, and there's all these kind of settings you can change. And so theoretically, you want to check across these settings to see if your results are robust to having different settings too. Also, this 2006 paper doesn't have the last economic growth data, the last 14 years or so, which will add a bunch to the reliability of the outcome. So essentially, we set about as redoing this 2006 paper and redoing it properly. So that's what we did. It's this kind of behemoth paper. It's like 70 pages. You've probably seen, well, maybe not if you're watching this. I wrote a summary of this in kind of normal human language, and George Francis also wrote this. And there's some Swedish people who wrote a summary about this, and some other English language people, and even some woke people complained about it. So all very good. We did all the good stuff. We added all the robustness tests. We have new data sets. We have multiple data sets. All the current like IQ estimates. But let's talk more details about the Bayesian meta-analysis. So as you can kind of hear, there's something Bayesian to it, and there's something meta-analysis to it. So really, what you want to do is that you have a bunch of predictors. So you have a bunch of things you think predict economic growth, or someone else thinks predict economic growth, and you want to disprove it, whatever the way. So you compile a big data set with all of these, and you got, say, 40 different things or so in your study, and then you fit all the models. Well, at least you try to fit the models. So you couldn't really fit one model with all 40 predictors because as you can see, you might have only a data set of 70 countries in the world, and with only 40 predictors and 70 cases, 70 countries, this, statistically speaking, it wouldn't work out. You will just get very uncertain estimates. So you cannot include all of them. So you got to do some kind of models, some kind of variable selection, as a machine learning person would call it. So you can do the normal stuff. You can do the lasso or rich regression, best subsets, or something like this. There's a nicer method, which is this BMA. The idea here is that people otherwise are cheating by choosing which covariates to include in a model. And so you're saying is that why don't we just try all the possible models? And you can see that this can become a statistical impossibility, because suppose you have 5 predictors. Every predictor, you can either put it into the model or you can leave it out. So for every predictor you have two options. So if you have five variables, you have 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 2 to the fifth power. And so this is still a reasonable number. A computer will run all these whatever number of models immediately, 30 or 60 or whatever the number is. You can do that immediately. However, what if you have 40 models? Well, 2 to the power of 40, that's impossible. No computer can fit this amount of models. And so what you really do is you just sample them at random. So for every model, you decide based on chance whether to include a given predictor or not. And then you fit, say, 10 million or 5 million models with varying predictors, which ones are included. Some models include intelligence, some don't. Some include colonial history, some don't, and so on. And this way you can get a sample of them. Once you have all these models, say the 1 million models, you do some kind of model fit. So some models fit better than others because they predict the outcome better. So they include some kind of variable that's important. And you could summarize this in different ways. You've got like the BIC and the AIC and the adjusted R squared and cross-validated stuff. And there's all kinds of options. You pick one of these. So you can rank all the million models now by how well it fits according to your one of these model fit criteria. And then you simply compute the weighted means for the predictors. So you take the first the top 10,000 models out of your 1 million, so that's a small subset, and then you compute the weighted mean, where the weight is the model fit. The better model fits, the more weight it's given, and then you see how variables are important, and that's basically it. You plot the results, and you have profit. So main results, we have two data sets. So the first data set looks like this. There are two parts to the results, the posterior inclusion probability and the absolute coefficient. So the posterior inclusion probability is that, suppose you ran 1 million models and you're looking now at the top 10,000 or the top 1,000 models as ordered by some kind of model fit, and you ask yourself the question, so which variables are in these models? Because a very good variable should be included in basically all the models, right? All the models that predict well, they should always include the most important variable. And so essentially you have this probability that a given variable is included in the best models. And you can see here in the top we've got national IQ together with GDP per capita. And so this is GDP per capita, which is what we're predicting, but this is the starting value in 1960. So you want to predict the economic growth from 1960 to 2020, 60 years, and you also include the GDP per capita of the country to begin with in 1960, because this captures this advantages of backwardness. It's easier to grow once you're already poor to begin with. And the most otherwise important variable is national intelligence, which beats everything else. But you can see in this dataset other important things to have higher GDP. Growth is to have mining, primary schooling, that is the distribution, how many kids are in primary school, and not being in the tropics. So the red colors mean it's negative, and this turquoise, the blue color means it's positive, yeah? Over here we have the coefficient. So that's the size of this coefficient, that how important it is. This one, whether it's included or not, this one, how important it is. So here we see that national IQ and being economically backwards to begin with, these are both, they're both very important. They're about equally important, in fact. And as I recall, you have to do some, just ignore this value for now. It's because the data has been log transferred, so this number, it corresponds to some like percentage growth thing, which is too difficult to go into here. But nevertheless, these are by far the most important ones compared to the others, with the, I don't know, between 2 and 3 times as important as these. And so it seems that when you kind of play fair and you use this super cool BMA method, then national IQ reigns supreme. So you might wonder then, is that just due to one data set? So here we've used the data set compiled by other people, and they've collected all the data for all these other variables, just not intelligence. So we just took their data set and we added intelligence to it. And there's a different group of people who compiled a different data set with different variables. And so they have these variables, and then we have the same kind of plot. You have to blame George Francis for not making the plot proportions the same. He needs to learn more about R coding. And so here we see the same sort of thing. We have the probability that the predictor is included in the model or not across the, the top 10,000 models or whatever the number may be. We see that it's the same story in the top, national intelligence, GDP per capita to begin with in 1960. These are important primary exports. I think this is very similar to the mining one because it's about whether you're exporting all these natural resources. Now it says life expectancy is important. Um, that one we didn't see here at all. Where is life expectancy? I don't even know where it is. It's not on the top. And but now it's important here, and we see there's no schooling here. So primary schooling is down here, now considered unimportant. It's not included in the best models. And here we see that being poor to begin with, according to the second data set, is more important than intelligence. But intelligence is very important, and also like being able to export like natural resource stuff and life expectancy. These are roughly half as important as intelligence. Everything else is kind of small, and so we kind of we kind of get the same kind of result as these skeptics were saying, that we tried two different data sets, and well, nothing is consistent much between the data sets, well, except for intelligence and being poor to begin with, and to some degree, natural resources, right? So we find some consistency. The other factors, they were not consistent. Here we have life expectancy. Here we had primary schooling. Here's also the tropical proportion of the population, but that one is not here. You have some other stuff like mean distance coast to river that were not down here, and so on, right? So there's some, it seems that they cannot really agree even across these kind of data sets. And so that's the robust ambiguity thing. So now you're asking, okay, so which national intelligence measures did you use? Well, we used the Rinderman ones. It's based on his compilation of these kind of PISA-like results, and he did a bunch of adjustments because some countries cheat. And so let's say China, they may give you the Chinese PISA results, but it turns out when you look at the sampling, well, they're all from like Shanghai or something, which is like a big kind of elite selected city. So you got to subtract like 5 IQ points or so because it's an elite city. It's not a representative sample. They didn't include all the peasants in the countryside, right? And some countries are much more honest. Even the PISA people themselves will sometimes label results as being not representative. I think Argentina recently used people only from the capital, and then the PISA people refused to accept this as a valid sample, so they've labeled it Buenos Aires or whatever as the results. Whatever the case, instead of using Rinderman's data, you could use something else. For instance, this is the original Richard Lynn dataset, 2002. There's the updated to 2012 lit Richard. That's the Rinderman, the Rinderman, but not using the IQ data. Rinderman with only the school results. There's the World Bank have their own harmonized learning outcome. That's also only using these kind of school tests. This is the original Hanushek stuff. They did their own kind of estimates, also based on school results. Becker did his own estimates based on school results. He also did them based on the IQ tests and the combination of them. But what we really see here is that the red line, that's kind of the prior, like what is the chance that this variable should be in the model to begin with, and the black bar then shows the posterior, so to say. So any variable that doesn't make it to this red line is basically not even doing as well as you would expect by chance. So anything that's far beyond the red line is something that's doing much better than chance. And we can see here we have 9 measures of intelligence, various versions of them, and you can see that all 9 of them are beyond the red line. Okay, the Becker one, not the Hanushek-Worsman here, is only at 40% or so. The Becker ones are at like 60 or so. Nevertheless, they're all far beyond, and 6 of the 9 are at 100% basically. So for 6 of the 9 datasets, national intelligence was always included among the best models, whereas here it was only a bit more than 50 or a bit less. The effect sizes here, that's the coefficient we saw over here. It also varies, but you can see when it's usually up here, it's roughly around 1. If you were to average across these datasets, the value would be a mean in this area, so about 1. So the results are reasonably robust to which dataset you're using. I believe the reason this one is very weak is because there's a very small number of countries with data from them. So it's reduced sample size. I don't know why the Becker ones are weaker than the other ones. I think Becker currently, for those wondering, he's currently not updating the dataset you have on the website because he's recompiling all studies from scratch. So one of the criticisms of the Richard Lynn compilations was always that it was based on kind of non-systematic approach to finding studies. Every time Richard Lynn kind of found a study, he included it or not, but it didn't like systematically seek out to find every study from, say, Belize, some obscure country. So someone has to go for every 200 countries in the world and do a systematic search for all studies from that country, including having to read the original language, whatever that may be, Spanish or Portuguese or what a French, whatever. So that's what Becker is currently doing, for those wondering. Um, Another option is you could say, okay, maybe national IQs, it's kind of a fluke. It works well. What if you just use a different GDP data set? So there are some people economists who compile these GDP per capita estimates, and so there's multiple versions of these tables. These are the Penn World Tables, kind of a longitudinal data set of GDP per data, and so the different colors here correspond to the different versions. And so you can see here we fit the same Bayesian Meta-analysis with all the same variables here, and we have the dots. So you can see that national intelligence, well, it has just about the same effect size no matter which version of this GDP data you look at, and the probabilities that it's included is always 100%. And the next question you could say, like, okay, what about this whole Bayesian prior thing? So the Bayesian prior in here really comes down to some Bayesian, what should we say, settings you have to choose about how to do the models, how to assign probability to these different models, the model fit settings, and so on. So there's a bunch of debates in the economic literature which of these kind of priors is the correct one. So here we've tried, I don't know, 4, 8, 12, 18 priors, but you can see all the dots are up here, and there's nothing up here, and there's nothing here. So it doesn't matter which prior you're using, you always get that national IQ is included and it has about the same effect size. So the priors don't matter, the dataset version didn't matter, who compiled the national IQ data, it mattered a little bit, but not too much. What about outliers? Yeah, maybe these results are just due to kind of China or something. That would actually kind of be ruled out because you already have some variables that are about they're about like Chinese things or fraction Catholic and this sort of thing. Sometimes you have Confucianism somewhere, or just Asian dummy variables. So any kind of obvious outlier couldn't really have a large effect because you would already kind of it would be included by one of these variables. But you can still run it. What if we just were to exclude some countries kind of at random? And so here we have this done, and so you can see that there are some ways. If you exclude a bunch of countries, then you can indeed get that intelligence doesn't work. But what you're really interested in this is this box, because the box plot, which is what this is, shows you the distribution of values. And so the left part of the box plot, that is the 25th centile. And the middle line is the 50th centile, and up the right one is the 75th centile. And what you really see for intelligence is that the box is tiny and it's up here, which tells you that even across all these resamplings of the data where you randomly leave out some countries, almost all the regressions still resulted in 100% chance that you need intelligence to explain economic growth. And as you can see, the coefficients over here are all very similar. They're also on top here. Of course, there are some where it goes down if you, by coincidence, exclude every high growth country, and then you can make intelligence seem unimportant, but that would be kind of dishonest. So again, outliers cannot explain the results. They're very robust here. By the way, if you're wondering about the size of this box, it's because we told the algorithm to always include GDP per capita, so that's why it's always included. Next thing, this prior skeptical study about BMA, it talked about the different growth periods. So in our main study, we're looking at GDP growth from 1960 to 2020, so 60 years. But what if we just looked at the different periods? Well, if you do that, then you still get this. Here we have tried a bunch of different 20-year periods. As you can see, the red line is the chance level finding. And whatever you see here is that every period gives a large signal for national intelligence. Even the 70s to 2009, or not to 70s to 95, this was the weakest result, and it was still far beyond chance. So clearly, national intelligence is very important. No matter what growth period you're looking at, it's still far beyond chance levels. Of course, it's less robust as compared to when you're looking at the full data, and you can see why. That is, of course, because when you are estimating economic growth from only 20 years, your signal has a lot more noise which country just happened to be poor in that time period and so on. But intelligence is very stable for populations. You really kind of have to replace your own population to change it. So you'd expect it to be very consistent over time, and so of course we'd expect something like this. The effect sizes are also kind of similar. Again, it's the average is basically about 1, which is what we saw before. So what about instrumental variables? Remember we talked about before how instrumental variables are very p-hacked. So we will also want to try these. And without going into the theory of how instrumental variables works, is that you have to choose another variable that has an effect on economic growth, but only through intelligence. And so we came up with the 3 plausible-ish ones, and the cranium capacity, which there has been estimated from old skulls, and you can do entropy adjusted UV variation. The idea being that it would have to go through intelligence. It's actually very highly correlated with. And you can also do H-heaping, which is these 19th century numeracy scores. So these are the H-heaping is the one where if you ask people in a census to fill out their name, well, they're going to give not a name, sorry. If you ask them to give their age, they're going to put an age there. And in cultures where people can't do math, people don't know how old they are. They can't calculate it. So when you ask them to say, how old are you? Well, they don't really put their age. They just kind of guess. So people say, I'm about 65 or I'm about 70. And so you get these big spikes when you plot the data, because there's a lot of people who are saying they're 70. There might be twice as many people claiming to be 70 as there are people claiming to be 69. And that's kind of impossible because you know almost the same number of people are alive with these two ages, because there's roughly the same number of births every year. And so what you really know is that a lot of people can't do math. And based on this, you can figure out which proportion of the population can do basic math, and you can convert that to kind of an IQ score. So I did this recently in a blog post, and you can use that as a kind of IQ scores before you had IQ scores. Of course, there's some public schooling issues with this sort of thing, but nevertheless, it's reasonable. We'll correlate about 0.8, 0.7 or so with modern IQs. And it's based on data from 1800s, so it's pretty old. If you do this sort of thing, you get essentially that if you include the controls, national intelligence, using the normal method, it has an effect size here of 0.11. And if you do it over here with these instrumental variables, you get 0.13, 0.14, 0.11. So these values are about the same. The idea of instrumental variables is that you can exclude some confounding variables or things you haven't measured based on some fancy assumptions, where we won't go into here. And based on these things, the results work out very well. These small stars you're seeing here, this is the star for the p-value being absurdly small, I think below 1 in 1,000. And so there's definitely no p-hacking here. It's not like we're getting p04 and this sort of thing. The results are very strong compared to the literature. If we go back and we kind of look at the economists, you can see that we're doing this one, and you can see most of the economists are cheating, so that's why they're getting values close to 2, whereas we're getting a set statistic that's more like 4 or 5 over here. I can't actually tell what the statistic is from this table, unfortunately. Going back to that, I guess you can take 11 divided by 0.3, so it will be 3.4 in that region. That said, the instrumental variable results look very strong. So that being said, let's do a summary of the study. We did a huge study, Bayesian Meta-analysis. We have 2 large data sets. These were compiled by other people, so we cannot be cheating which variables to exclude or include or not, because they were made by other people. We used the Bayesian model averaging to avoid any claims that we're just reporting the models that just happen to favor national intelligence. In fact, we're doing this fancy weighted methods that automatically gives the most weight to the models that explain the data the best, and then take a weighted mean of these to see which variables work the best. And it just so happens that of all the variables we tested, national intelligence works the best, aside from the one about being poor to begin with. Intelligence, it passes with flying colors. It's by far the best. We carried out a lot of these, all the variations of the study to see how results, how robust they were. We have the 2 different data sets, as I mentioned. We got 5 different versions of the GDP version estimates. We got 7 different growth periods, the 20-year growth periods. We got 9 different IQ estimates. So these were the Becker, the Lin, the Lindemann, and all these. We got 18 different priors as a setting used in the Bayesian stuff. And no matter how it is you do this, national IQ is still far above chance. So insofar as you can use this sort of thing, national intelligence is really the best variable to explain. So we can really kind of say fairly confidently based on this kind of result is that if you want to grow consistently, you want to be smart and you want to just happen to be poor to begin with. So essentially, if you want to grow very fast, you want to be like Singapore, where you're kind of stuck in a swamp with a bunch of smart people and you're like, let's build a good country. Um, the conclusion really is escapable. Economists have been ignoring the most important cause of economic growth. So that's kind of silly. Like you have an entire discipline, and their goal is to tell policymakers how do we get more economic growth, and they've been like, I'm not seeing any national intelligence here. So we really need an outreach campaign. So I suggest you go to your local economists. Have you heard the good news? We've found the main cause of economic growth. Let me introduce you to the bell curve. Good night.